My daughter thought my hands were only good for fixing engines, until the world realized those same hands had painted her entire future. My name is ZAHA. I am 68 years old, and my life is a story told in two different languages, the language of iron and the language of light. To the world, and especially to my daughter, Angela, I am a man of iron. I am the owner of ZAHA's Heavy Repair, a shop that sits in the industrial guts of the city. I am the man with the permanent grease under his fingernails and the scent of burnt diesel clinging to his skin. For 40 years, I have been a creature of the shadows, a mechanic who moves through the world like a ghost in coveralls. But in the basement of that shop, behind a heavy steel door that stays locked even from the memories of my children, I am a man of light. It was 3 a.m., the hour when the city holds its breath. I stood before a canvas, my thick, scarred fingers gripping a delicate palette knife with a tenderness that would have shocked anyone who had seen me haul a semi-truck transmission. I was finishing the painting for Angela's 35th birthday. It was a landscape of the old valley where we used to live before the mills closed, a place of violet shadows and golden wheat, painted with the raw, textured intensity of a man who has spent a lifetime holding back his own soul. I wiped a smudge of Prussian blue onto a rag. My back screamed at me. My knees felt like they were filled with crushed glass. But as the first light of dawn hit the canvas, I felt a spark of something I hadn't felt in decades. It was beautiful. It was the best thing I had ever done. It was 40 years of unspoken love, distilled into oil and pigment. The sharp, clinical chirp of my phone broke the spell. I reached for it, my heart doing that small, pathetic dance it always does when I see Angela's name on the screen. She was a senior curator, now at the Vanguard Gallery. She lived in a world of minimalist lofts and black-tie galas. I hadn't seen her in 3 months. The text was a cold blade. "Dad, let's be clear about the birthday dinner tonight," it read. "It's at L'Etoile. It's a very high-end crowd. Please, do me a favor, don't bring any handmade gifts. I'm trying to impress the board members who will be there. And for heaven's sake, scrub your hands. I can't have you looking like you just crawled out of a grease pit. Also, we need to discuss your long-term plans. Julian and I have decided we won't be your caretakers. We're moving to London for a year. Deal with old age alone. Don't make a scene." I stared at the screen until the letters blurred. Deal with old age alone. I looked at the painting. It was still wet. It represented the $12,000 I had spent on her first art history degree. It represented the $50,000 I had secretly funneled into her gallery's opening through an anonymous angel investor account. I had spent 40 years being a disgrace so she could be an authority. I didn't reply. I couldn't. I just sat there in the dim light of the shop, the smell of turpentine clashing with the smell of motor oil, and realized that I had raised a daughter who could see the value in a brushstroke, but was blind to the man who held the brush. L'Etoile was a restaurant that felt more like a laboratory for the wealthy. It was all white surfaces, sharp edges, and whispers. When I walked in, wearing my one charcoal suit and my hands scrubbed so hard they were raw and beet red, the hostess looked at me as if I were a leak in the ceiling. Angela was sitting at a long table with 6 other people. They all looked like they were made of glass, fragile, expensive, and transparent. "Happy birthday, Angela," I said, standing at the head of the table. Angela didn't stand up. She gave me a tight, professional smile. "Dad, you made it. And you brought something." I was holding the painting, wrapped in brown butcher paper and tied with a simple piece of twine. "I made it for you. It's the valley, from when you were small." A ripple of stifled laughter went around the table. One man, a tall, gaunt fellow with a silk scarf, leaned forward. "Oh, how charming. Handmade. Is it a folk art piece, then? Or perhaps found object?" Angela's face turned a deep, burning crimson. "Dad, I told you. No gifts. This isn't the place for sentimentality." "It's not just sentiment, Angela," I said softly. "It's a piece of me. Just put it under the table," she hissed, her voice a sharp, jagged edge. "Julian and I were just discussing the London move. We really think it's best if you look into those assisted living communities in the suburbs. Somewhere where you won't have to worry about the shop. You're becoming a bit of a social liability, Dad. Dealing with your image is becoming a full-time job for me." "A liability?" I asked. I felt the weight of 40 years of silence finally starting to crack. "Leave this place at once," a voice suddenly boomed. It was Julian, Her fiancé, standing up. He was a man who specialized in luxury acquisitions. He looked at me with pure, unadulterated disgust. You're ruining her night. You show up here looking like a common laborer, dragging a piece of trash wrapped in paper, and expect us to applaud? You're a disgrace to everything Angela has built. Get out. I looked at Angela. I waited for her to defend me. I waited for her to say, "This is the man who paid for your life." She didn't. She looked at her wine glass. He's right, Dad. You don't belong here. Just deal with it. Leave the painting if you must, but just go. I didn't say a word. I turned and walked out of the restaurant. I walked past the Ferraris and the Porsches, feeling the cold night air hit my face. I stopped by the large, industrial dumpster in the alleyway behind the restaurant. I stood there for a long time. Then, I heard the back door of the restaurant open. I stepped into the shadows. Angela walked out, followed by Julian. She was carrying the painting. "God, it's so heavy," she complained. "What am I supposed to do with this? I can't have this folk art cluttering up the loft. It's embarrassing." "Just toss it, darling," Julian said, lighting a cigarette. "It's probably just some amateur drivel. Your father is a mechanic, not a master. Let the trash collectors deal with his soul." Angela didn't hesitate. She swung the brown paper package and tossed it into the dumpster. It landed with a dull, sickening thud against a pile of discarded wine bottles. "There," she said, wiping her hands on a silk napkin. "Problem solved. Now, let's go back in and have the real cake." They went back inside. I waited until the door clicked shut. Then, I walked to the dumpster. My knees hurt as I climbed the side, but I didn't care. I reached in and pulled the painting out. The twine had snapped, and the paper was torn. I peeled back the butcher paper. The light of the street lamp hit the canvas. The violet shadows. The golden wheat. It was still perfect. I whispered to the empty alleyway. "And I am 68 years old. And I am done being invisible. There is no pain like seeing your heart's work treated like trash by the one person you created it for. Have you ever given someone a piece of your soul only to have them throw it back in your face? Tell me your story in the comments." I walked back to my truck. I didn't go home. I went back to the shop. I sat in my basement studio and I called a man I hadn't spoken to in 30 years. A man who used to be a prominent gallery owner before I chose the safe life of a mechanic to pay for Angela's world. "It's ZAHA," I said when he picked up. "I have a piece. I think it's time for the silent architect to have an opening." The drive back to the workshop was a blur of orange streetlights and the rhythmic, mocking thump-thump of the tires over the expansion joints of the bridge. On the passenger seat, the painting sat partially unwrapped, the torn butcher paper rustling in the draft of the heater. Every time I glanced at it, I saw the valley, the place where I had once been a young man with a palette and a dream, before the reality of a hungry child and a dying mill turned me into a man with a wrench and a debt. I reached the shop at 2 a.m. The industrial district was a ghost town of corrugated metal and chain-link fences. I didn't go to my apartment. I went straight to the basement. I set the canvas on the easel. In the harsh, clinical glare of the fluorescent overheads, the damage was visible. There was a smear of coffee on the left corner, likely from the restaurant's trash, and a small, jagged tear in the paper where it had struck a wine bottle. I didn't panic. I moved with the steady, calm hand of a surgeon. I spent the next 4 hours cleaning it. I used a Q-tip and a specialized solvent I'd kept in a cabinet for 20 years. I worked until my eyes burned and the tremor in my right hand became a violent shake. As I worked, the words of the dinner rang in my ears. A social liability. Common laborer. Toss it, darling. The phone on my workbench vibrated. It was a notification from Angela's social media. She had posted a photo of the dessert course at Latoile. The caption read, "Surrounded by elegance and those who truly understand the value of the sublime." Finally, the clutter is gone. The clutter. 40 years of my life, summarized as clutter. I stood up, my knees cracking like a gunshot in the silent basement. I looked at the painting. It was clean now. The violet shadows of the valley seemed to glow, pulsing with a life that no dumpster could extinguish. I picked up the phone and dialed Marcus. Marcus Thorne had been the premier art dealer in the city back in the 80s. He was the one who had told me, when I was 25, that I had the hand of a master and the soul of a poet. But poetry didn't pay for pediatricians, and masters didn't have health insurance. I had walked away from his gallery and never looked back, choosing the grease of the garage over the glamour of the canvas. "Zaha." Marcus's voice was sleep-thickened but instantly sharp. "Do you have any idea what time it is? I haven't heard from you since the Reagan administration." "I have a piece, Marcus," I said. My voice was raspy, sounding like sandpaper on stone. "It's the valley. The one we talked about 40 years ago." There was a long silence on the other end. I could hear Marcus shifting in bed, the rustle of expensive sheets. "You're still painting ZAHA? After all this time in that grease pit?" "I never stopped," I whispered. "I just stopped showing it." "Bring it to the warehouse at dawn," Marcus said, his tone shifting into professional curiosity. "If it's what I remember, we might have something to talk about." Dawn at the docks was a gray, bruising affair. Marcus was waiting in front of his private viewing room, a climate-controlled sanctuary hidden behind an unmarked steel door. He looked older, thinner, with silver hair pulled back into a tight ponytail, but his eyes were still the same. Two cold, blue lenses that could spot a fake from 100 yards. He didn't say hello. He just gestured to the easel in the center of the room. I unwrapped the painting. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of vulnerability. This was the work Angela had called amateur drivel. This was the piece Julian had called trash. Marcus walked toward the canvas. He didn't speak. He pulled a magnifying loupe from his pocket and leaned in so close his breath misted the oil. He moved from the foreground wheat to the violet peaks of the mountains. He looked at the way I had layered the light, using a technique I perfected by watching the way sun reflected off chrome bumpers in the shop. 5 minutes passed. 10. The silence in the room was so thick I could hear the hum of the air purifier. "You've been hiding," Marcus finally said, straightening up. He looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw something in his eyes that looked like awe. "For 40 years, you've been sitting in a basement, painting like a god, and you've been telling the world you're just a mechanic." "I had a daughter to raise," I said simply. "Art is a gamble. Iron is a certainty." "Zaha," Marcus said, stepping back to take in the whole piece. "This isn't just a painting. This is a ghost. It's the kind of work collectors kill for. It has the technical precision of the old masters, but the raw, industrial ache of the modern world. It's a masterpiece." "What's it worth, Marcus? Give me a real number, not a friend's number." Marcus leaned against a velvet-covered table. "In the current market? With the story of this silent master who worked in a garage? If we put this up at the sovereign auction next month, I wouldn't let it go for a penny under $500,000. I felt the air leave my lungs. $500,000. That was more than the value of my shop. It was more than the trust fund I had depleted for Angela's gallery. It was a fortune built out of the very trash she had discarded. "But there's a catch," Marcus said. "To get that price, we need to build the myth. No one can know it's you yet. We list it under your old pseudonym, the architect. We let the galleries fight over it. We let the elite, including your daughter's circle, bid on it without knowing the dirty mechanic they look down on is the one who created it." I looked at my hands. The grease was still there, etched into the lines of my palms. I thought of Angela's face at dinner, the way she had looked at these hands with such profound disappointment. "Do it," I said, "but I want one condition." "Anything," Marcus replied. "I want the private viewing to be hosted at the Vanguard Gallery," I said. "I want my daughter to be the one who has to curate the masterpiece she threw in the trash." The next 2 weeks were a study in irony. I went back to the shop every day. I fixed brakes. I changed oil. I listened to the complaints of truck drivers and the clank of metal on metal. But at night, I was on the phone with Marcus, watching the buzz grow. The architect was the talk of the art world. A lost soul, a master hidden in plain sight. The rumors were swirling. Was he a hermit? A fallen aristocrat? Meanwhile, Angela's world was beginning to fray. I saw it on the news. The Vanguard Gallery was struggling. A major investor had pulled out, and she was desperate for a win to save her reputation before the London move. She called me for the first time in weeks. I was under a semi-truck, the smell of diesel thick in my lungs. "Dad," she said, her voice sounding stressed and thin. I'm busy, but I wanted to let you know that the gallery is hosting a massive event. A private showing for a new artist, the architect. It's the biggest thing in the city. I won't have time to see you for a while. And please, don't call me. I need to focus. Julian and I are under a lot of pressure." "I understand, Angela," I said, wiping a drop of oil off my cheek with a rag. "You have to focus on what's valuable. Exactly, she said. I'm glad you finally get it. Oh, and by the way, that thing you gave me for my birthday? I had to put it in storage. It just didn't fit the new aesthetic. I hope you're not offended. Storage, I repeated. I'm not offended, Angela. I'm enlightened. I hung up. I looked at the wrench in my hand. Then I looked at the dark corner of the shop where I had spent 40 years hiding the light. The emotional spark wasn't a flame of anger anymore. It was a cold, bright star of resolve. Angela was about to host the auction of her life, and she was about to find out that the trash she threw away was the only thing that could have saved her. It's a powerful thing when the world finally recognizes what those closest to you chose to ignore. ZAHA is setting a trap of pure truth. Do you think he's being too calculated, or is this the only way to make Angela see her own shallowness? Let's hear your take in the comments. I stood up and walked to the sink. I washed my hands, but for the first time, I didn't care if the grease stayed. I knew what was underneath it. The auction was in 3 days. The stage was set, and the silent architect was ready to take his bow. The Vanguard Gallery was a cathedral of white space and clinical lighting, located in a district where the sidewalks were swept twice a day and the air felt expensive. Angela moved through the halls like a trapped bird, her heels clicking a frantic, irregular rhythm on the polished concrete. She was on her third espresso of the morning, her phone a permanent extension of her hand. Resistance, for Angela, took the form of frantic motion. She was resisting the collapse of her social identity. 2 of her primary investors had pulled their funding after a botched European acquisition, and the London move, her great escape from her humble roots, was beginning to look like a pipe dream. She needed a miracle. She needed the architect. "Marcus, please," Angela said into her phone, her voice pitched in that high, strained tone she used when she was losing control. "The Vanguard is the perfect venue for the reveal. We have the demographic. We have the prestige. If you give the exclusive viewing to the Sotheby crowd, you're missing the new money heat. I can guarantee a starting bid that will set a record." Across town, in a climate-controlled office that smelled of old paper and victory, Marcus Thorne leaned back in his leather chair. He had the speakerphone on. ZAHA sat across from him, wearing his navy work coveralls, his thick fingers tracing the rim of a paper coffee cup. "I have dozens of galleries begging for this, Angela," Marcus said, his eyes meeting ZAHA's. "The architect is selective. He doesn't care for prestige. He cares about the work being seen by those who truly understand its cost." "I understand it," Angela nearly shouted. "I've seen the digital preview you sent out. The brushwork, the use of violet and gold, it's transcendent. It reminds me of the old masters, but with a grit it's visceral. It's exactly what the market is starving for. Please, Marcus, if I don't get this show, the Vanguard might not survive the quarter." ZAHA listened to his daughter's voice. It was the voice of a curator, a businesswoman, a social climber. There was no trace of the little girl who used to sit on his lap in the shop and ask him why the stars were so bright. She was fighting for her gallery, for her brand, but she wasn't fighting for the art. She was fighting to stay above the clutter. ZAHA signaled to Marcus with a slow nod. "All right, Angela," Marcus said. "The architect has agreed. But there are conditions. It is a one-night-only blind auction. The painting stays partially veiled until the final bid is accepted, and the artist will be present, but he will remain in the shadows until the gavel falls. No press until the sale is final." "Anything," Angela breathed, her relief so palpable it crackled through the phone. "I'll handle everything. The guest list will be elite. Julian is already reaching out to his hedge fund contacts. This will be the event of the decade." "One more thing," Marcus added, his voice dropping an octave. "The architect requested that the gallery's back alley entrance be used for his arrival. He doesn't care for the red carpet." Of course," Angela said dismissively. "Artists and their quirks. I'll have the staff clear the service entrance." While Angela spent the next 48 hours in a whirlwind of high-stakes marketing and floral arrangements, ZAHA returned to the basement of the shop. He didn't paint. He just sat. He looked at the empty easel where the masterpiece had stood. He felt a strange, cold resistance of his own. Part of him wanted to call her. Part of him wanted to say, "Angela, it's me. Look at my hands. Look at the man who gave you everything. You don't need a miracle. You just need to see your father." But he knew it wouldn't work. To Angela, ZAHA the mechanic and ZAHA the artist could not exist in the same body. In her world, You were either a creator or a laborer. You were either the sublime or the clutter. He spent the evening before the auction doing something he hadn't done in years. He went through the old boxes in the attic of the shop. He found a photograph of his wife, Martha, taken just before she died. She was holding an infant Angela. In the background, the walls of their tiny apartment were covered in ZAHA's early sketches, vibrant, hopeful things that had never seen the light of a gallery. He remembered Martha's last words. "Don't let the world take the color out of your eyes, ZAHA. But don't let our daughter go hungry for the sake of a canvas." He had taken those words literally. He had traded the color for the bread. He had buried the artist to become the provider. And in doing so, he had allowed Angela to grow up believing that the bread appeared by magic, and that the man who provided it had no color left in him. The resistance in ZAHA's heart hardened. This wasn't just about the $500,000. It was about a 40-year-old debt of truth. The night of the auction arrived. The Vanguard Gallery was transformed. The minimalist white walls were draped in black velvet. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and the sharp, metallic tang of expensive champagne. Angela was a vision in a black silk gown, her hair pulled back in a severe, elegant bun. She moved through the crowd of millionaires and critics, her smile practiced and porcelain. Julian stood by her side, looking every bit the luxury acquisition specialist, whispering in the ears of men whose net worth was measured in billions. "The architect's piece is behind that screen," Angela whispered to a prominent collector. "Marcus tells me it's the most significant find in 30 years. A silent master who has been working in isolation." "Where is he?" the collector asked, looking toward the dark corner of the room where a single, heavy velvet curtain stood. "He's here," Angela said, a flicker of genuine excitement crossing her face. "But he's private. He'll reveal himself once the price is met." In the back alley, far away from the flashing cameras and the silk gowns, a battered Ford truck pulled up to the service entrance. ZAHA stepped out. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo. He was wearing his clean work suit, the charcoal one. His hands were scrubbed, but the black lines of the shop were still there, etched into his skin like a permanent signature. He carried a small bag containing his palette knife, the one he had used to create this sublime. Marcus was waiting at the door. "Are you ready, ZAHA? Once we walk in there, the silent architect is dead, and the world finds out who you really are." ZAHA looked at the brick walls of the alley, then at the bright, artificial glow of the gallery windows above. He thought of the dumpster where his heart had landed just 2 weeks ago. "I've been ready for 40 years, Marcus," ZAHA said. They entered the service elevator. As it rose, the sound of the party grew. The clinking of crystal, the murmurs of the elite, the sound of a world that viewed ZAHA as a liability. The elevator doors opened into the darkened artist's alcove behind the main stage. ZAHA stood in the shadows, looking through the gap in the curtains. He saw Angela. She was standing beneath a spotlight, her face radiant with the thrill of the sale. She looked powerful. She looked successful. And she looked completely, utterly blind. "Ladies and gentlemen," Angela's voice rang out, amplified by the gallery's acoustics. "Tonight, we witness history. We witness the unveiling of the Valley of the Silent, a work that proves that true genius cannot be hidden, no matter how deep the shadows. The architect is among us. Let the bidding begin at $300,000. The room erupted. ZAHA watched his daughter. He watched her sell the soul she had thrown in the trash. The resistance was over. The truth was about to take the stage. There is a terrifying power in being the only person in a room who knows the truth. Angela thinks she is at the peak of her career, but she's actually standing on the edge of a cliff. Do you think she deserves the shock that's coming? Or is ZAHA being too cruel by letting her sell him to the world? Tell me your thoughts. I'm reading every comment. The bidding climbed. 400,000. 450. $500,000. Julian shouted from the front row, trying to drive the price up for the gallery's prestige. "Going once," Angela cried, her eyes shining with tears of triumph. "Going twice." ZAHA stepped toward the curtain. His hand gripped the heavy velvet. "Sold," Angela screamed, the gavel hitting the podium with a crack that sounded like a breaking heart. To the gentleman in the front. "And now, the moment you've all been waiting for. Please welcome the architect." The gavel's sharp crack resonated through the Vanguard Gallery, a sound that sealed Angela's triumph. $500,000. Sold. To the gentleman in the front, she beamed, her voice a cascade of pure, unadulterated elation. Her eyes were shining, not with the aesthetic appreciation of art, but with the ruthless calculation of a businesswoman who had just saved her career. And now, Angela announced, stepping forward, bathed in the blinding white light of the spotlight, the moment you've all been waiting for. Please, a warm welcome for the visionary behind this masterpiece, the legendary architect. The black velvet curtain behind the stage, which had shrouded the artist in mystery, shimmered with an unseen hand. The crowd held its collective breath. Julian, in the front row, adjusted his tie, already calculating the boost this would give his own luxury acquisitions brand. Critics leaned forward, pens poised. The whispers in the room died, replaced by an expectant hush. Then, the curtain parted. It wasn't a bohemian artist in a flowing silk tunic. It wasn't a reclusive intellectual with spectacles and a carefully cultivated mystique. It was ZAHA. He stood there in his clean but unmistakably functional charcoal work suit. His hands, though scrubbed, still bore the indelible marks of a lifetime spent under engines, the darkened creases, the slightly crooked finger. His face was etched with the weariness of 68 years, but his eyes, deep-set and clear, held a steady, unwavering gaze that swept across the stunned faces in the gallery. There was no arrogance, no triumph, just the quiet dignity of a man who had finally chosen to be seen. A single, audible gasp escaped Angela's lips. It was a small sound, but in the echoing silence of the gallery, it felt like a thunderclap. Her smile, which moments before had stretched from ear to ear, dissolved, twisting into a grotesque mask of horror and disbelief. Her meticulously coiffed hair seemed to prickle. The microphone she held felt suddenly heavy, cold. Julian, in the front row, sprang to his feet, his face contorted in a silent scream. What is this? Who is that man? The spotlights, once focused solely on Angela, swiveled to engulf ZAHA, casting long, stark shadows across the pristine white walls. The flash of cameras, held at bay until the artist's reveal, erupted in a blinding, stroboscopic frenzy. Each flash was a pinprick of agony for Angela, exposing her in that forced proximity to the very disgrace she had so desperately tried to hide. "Angela," ZAHA said, his voice, unamplified, cut through the buzzing silence, calm and unhurried. "You asked to meet the architect. Here I am." Angela's mind raced, a hamster on a broken wheel. "No, this isn't happening. This is a joke. A nightmare." She turned to Marcus, who stood just off stage, a faint, knowing smile playing on his lips. "Marcus, what is this? This isn't the architect. This is my father. He's a mechanic. This is a mistake. A publicity stunt." Marcus merely inclined his head. "Indeed, Angela. Your father is the architect. His work has been displayed under that pseudonym for the past 40 years. The room erupted into a cacophony of whispers, gasps, and frantic questions. Reporters surged forward, their microphones thrust toward ZAHA. "Mr. Vance, is it true you're a mechanic by trade? Why the pseudonym, the architect? Is this the $500,000 painting that just sold for a record amount?" Angela felt a cold sweat prickle her scalp. She looked at Julian, who was now being questioned by a furious reporter, his face a roadmap of impending financial ruin. She looked at the faces of the board members, their expressions ranging from shock to thinly veiled amusement. The elegance she had curated so meticulously was crumbling around her like dry plaster. "This is impossible," Angela finally shrieked into the microphone, her voice high and desperate, amplifying her panic to the entire gallery. "This painting, this masterpiece, it's the piece of garbage he gave me for my birthday. I threw it in the dumpster. Julian and I watched him pick it out of the trash." The words, raw and unfiltered, hung in the air, captured by a dozen microphones and 100 recording devices. The already chaotic room exploded. The revelation that the $500,000 painting, the talk of the art world, had been discarded as literal trash by the very curator who now stood to profit from its sale, was a scandal of epic proportions. ZAHA, standing calmly beside the unveiled painting, didn't flinch. He simply looked at Angela, his gaze steady. "Indeed, Angela, you discarded it, like so many other things you deemed clutter. This painting, which I poured my soul into, was not valuable enough for your loft. It was not prestigious enough for your carefully curated life." He paused, then turned to the assembled crowd, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had nothing left to lose. "For 40 years, I worked in silence. I chose the certainty of grease and steel over the gamble of a canvas, so that my daughter, Angela, could have the life she deserved. So she could walk among you, believing she was a senior curator, an expert in value and prestige. I became the architect in secret, funding her dreams, building her world, while she cultivated a taste for the sublime that excluded the man who built it." He gestured to the painting. "This piece, The Valley of the Silent, is a testament to the sacrifice of the unseen. It's the valley where I buried my dreams so my daughter could fly. And tonight, Angela, you have curated my truth. You have publicly sold the heart you threw away." Angela felt the blood drain from her face. She looked at the painting, the vibrant colors, the raw texture, the undeniable power of it. She remembered the valley. She remembered the warmth of her father's hand as he pointed out the way the light hit the wheat fields when she was a little girl. She had dismissed it then, too. She had been too busy looking at the shiny wrapper of the candy bar in her other hand. Now, that candy bar had turned to ash. Julian, red-faced and furious, pushed through the crowd. "This is slander. This is an outrageous lie. Amelia, call security. Have this man removed. He's trying to sabotage us." "Sabotage?" ZAHA chuckled, a dry, weary sound. "Julian, you tried to acquire a masterpiece with a credit line that was backed by the very artist you insulted. You are not a collector. You are an imposter. And as for your precious London move, the bank accounts I quietly funded for Angela's career advancement have been closed. There is no London for you. There is only the bill for this party, which, I believe, will now be coming to you and Angela directly." The crowd buzzed again, a fresh wave of scandal crashing over the gallery. News anchors, who had been broadcasting live, were now scrambling, their voices urgent, excited. The story was no longer just about a lost master. It was about betrayal, hubris, and the epic downfall of a high society darling. Angela dropped the microphone. It hit the marble with a dull thud, the feedback shrieking through the speakers. She looked at ZAHA, her father, the man she had loved, despised, and ultimately erased. He wasn't looking at her with anger. He was looking at her with a profound, aching pity. "You wanted to deal with old age alone, Angela," ZAHA said, his voice soft but clear, cutting through the chaos. "And tonight, for the first time, you have nothing left to hide behind. You have no career, no fiancé, no reputation. You are just a woman standing in a ruined gallery, holding the pieces of a life you built on a lie. You are truly alone." He turned and walked toward the unveiled painting, his footsteps echoing in the suddenly silent gallery. He gently touched the canvas, his scarred fingers brushing the textured paint. "This is not a painting, Angela," ZAHA said, his back to her. "This is the 40 years you thought were clutter. It's the silence. It's the sacrifice. It's me." And tonight, it found its voice. Angela looked at her reflection in the polished marble floor. She saw the smeared makeup, the ruined gown, the desperate, hollow eyes. She saw the face of a woman who had traded her soul for a price tag. And for the first time, she saw the grease, not as a stain, but as the very foundation of her existence. The forced proximity of the stage, the glaring lights, the judging eyes of the world, it had stripped her bare. She had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The social divide between her curated world and his honest one had just violently collapsed, burying her under the rubble of her own ambition. The hammer has fallen, and the truth has been unveiled. Angela is publicly humiliated, stripped of everything she valued. Was ZAHA's public shaming of his daughter necessary to make her see the truth, or was it an act of cruelty? Do you think she can ever recover from this? And if so, how? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Angela sank to her knees, not caring about the cameras, not caring about the critics, not caring about the whispers. She just stared at the painting, at the vibrant valley, at the life her father had poured into it. And for the first time, she cried not for herself, but for the man who had loved her enough to become a ghost. The aftermath of the auction felt like the cooling of a furnace. The reporters had eventually been ushered out by a grim-faced Marcus, and Julian had fled the scene the moment he realized the architect's accounts were inaccessible to him. The Vanguard Gallery, once a temple of high society pretension, was now a hollowed-out shell. Angela sat on the floor of the stage, her black silk gown pooling around her like an oil slick. She was staring at the painting, but she wasn't seeing the $500,000 price tag. She was seeing the brushstrokes. Up close, without the ego of a curator, she could see the trembling precision of a man who had fought against his own exhausted muscles to create beauty. ZAHA sat on the edge of the speaker's podium, his heavy boots resting on the white marble. He didn't look at his daughter with triumph. He looked at her with the weariness of a man who had finally finished a marathon he never wanted to run. "You want to know how it started, Angela?" ZAHA asked, his voice echoing in the vast, empty space. "You want to know why the architect went underground?" Angela didn't look up, but she nodded, a small, jerky movement. ZAHA reached into his charcoal jacket and pulled out a small, tattered leather-bound notebook. It was stained with old oil and yellowed with age. He opened it to the first page. "It was 1985, ZAHA began. The year you were born. Your mother, Martha, and I lived in a studio apartment above a bakery. The air always smelled of yeast and hope. I was a painter then. A real one. I had talent, everyone said so. But talent doesn't pay for heat in a February blizzard." He leaned back, his eyes unfocused as he drifted back 40 years. "I remember the night you came home from the hospital. Martha was so thin, so pale. We had exactly $40 in the bank. I had a gallery show scheduled for that weekend, my big break. I had poured everything into it. I thought, this is it. This is how I provide." He turned a page in the notebook. There was a sketch of a baby's hand clutching a paintbrush. "The show was a critical success," ZAHA whispered, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "The critics loved the raw emotion. But they didn't buy anything. They drank the wine, they patted me on the back, and they went home to their warm houses. I came home to an apartment where the pipes had frozen and you were crying because you were cold. Martha was trying to warm your milk over a candle." Angela finally looked at him, her eyes red-rimmed and wide. "I walked out that night," ZAHA continued. "I walked until I reached the industrial district. I saw a sign on a garage, mechanic wanted. No experience necessary. We train. I looked at my hands, the hands that had just painted a masterpiece, and I realized they were useless if they couldn't turn on a furnace. I walked in, lied about my age, and started as a grease monkey the next morning." "But you kept painting," Angela whispered. "I had to," ZAHA said. "It was the only way I could stay sane. But Martha, she saw the toll it took. She saw me working 14 hours at the shop, and then coming home to paint for 5 more. She made me promise. She said, 'ZAHA, if Angela grows up seeing you struggle like this, she will hate the art. She will fear the life of a creator. Give her the life we didn't have. Let her think the world is a polished place.'" He pulled out a folded, brittle piece of paper from the notebook. It was a foreclosure notice from 1992. "I didn't just become a mechanic, Angela. I became a ghost. I created the architect because I didn't want my dirty reputation as a laborer to devalue the work. I sold pieces through Marcus for decades, anonymously. Every cent of that money went into your legacy fund. The tuition for the private schools where you learned to look down on people like me, paid for by the architect. The designer clothes you wore to fit in with the Julian types, paid for by the architect." ZAHA stood up and walked over to the painting. He pointed to a small, nearly invisible detail in the corner, a tiny, silver wrench hidden in the shadow of a wheat stalk. "I left clues," ZAHA said. "Small signs that I was still there. I waited for you to see them. I thought that once you became a senior curator, you would look at a piece and see the truth. I thought you would see the soul of the man who raised you." "I was too busy looking at the labels," Angela said, her voice breaking. "I was too busy trying to prove I belonged in rooms like this. I thought if I acknowledged where I came from, the world would take everything away from me. The world didn't take it away, Angela," ZAHA said softly. "You threw it away. You stood in that alleyway and called my heart trash because it didn't have a signature you recognized. You valued the myth of the architect, but you despised the man who lived the reality." ZAHA reached out and took Angela's hand. He turned it over, looking at her soft, manicured palm. "Your mother wanted you to be light," ZAHA said. "But light things are easily blown away. I should have let you see the grease. I should have let you see the struggle. Maybe then you wouldn't have been so quick to disown the foundation you were standing on. The revelation of the backstory was a crushing weight. Angela realized that every lucky break she'd had was actually her father's blood. The angel investor who had saved her gallery 3 years ago, it wasn't a corporate fund. It was ZAHA selling a small collection of sketches. The anonymous scholarship that paid for her internship in Paris? It was ZAHA working triple shifts at the shipyard. She looked at the $500,000 painting. It wasn't a victory, it was a bill. A bill for 40 years of a man's life that she had never bothered to acknowledge. The money is in an account for you, Angela, ZAHA said, letting go of her hand. The $500,000. It's enough to pay off the gallery's debts and start over. But I won't be the architect for you anymore. I'm going back to the shop. I have a truck coming in tomorrow with a busted transmission. It's honest work. It makes sense. Dad, wait, Angela said, scrambling to her feet. I don't want the money. Not like this. The money is what you wanted, isn't it? ZAHA asked, pausing at the edge of the stage. It's the only language you've spoken for a decade. Use it to buy a new aesthetic. Use it to find a new Julian. Or maybe, just maybe, use it to find yourself. He walked away, his heavy boots echoing on the marble one last time. He didn't look back as he pushed through the velvet curtains and disappeared into the service elevator. Angela stood alone in the center of the dark gallery. The social divide was no longer a gap between them. It was a canyon. She looked at the painting, the Valley of the Silent, and for the first time in her life, she saw the man. She saw the silence. She saw the sacrifice. The backstory had unveiled a truth so bright it blinded her. She had been the curator of a life she didn't own, and the man she had called a disgrace was the only master she had ever known. Knowing the full extent of ZAHA's sacrifice makes Angela's betrayal feel even heavier. Do you think a parent should ever hide their struggles from their children, or does it always lead to this kind of entitlement? If you were Angela, could you ever spend that $500,000 knowing where it truly came from? Let's talk about the weight of parental love in the comments. Angela walked over to the painting. She didn't call for security. She didn't call a cab. She sat on the floor beneath the canvas and stayed there until the sun began to rise over the city, casting the same violet and gold light across the floor that her father had captured on the canvas. This silent architect was gone, but the daughter he had built was finally starting to realize she was made of more than just glass. Thank you so much for watching my story all the way to the end. Your support means everything. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts.